All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick Hedger with the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation and our App Security Project. Our organization is a nonprofit, nonpartisan taxpayer and consumer advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. Later this month, actually later this week, we'll be celebrating Halloween, the holiday where children and families go door to door accepting treats, oftentimes from strangers. This month also happens to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Yet all year long, we all go virtually, door to door, online. And what do? We accept cookies from strangers. So while many are preparing their kids for a safe Halloween experience, it's also the perfect time to talk about having safe online experiences and why that's so important and what American policymakers are or are not doing to improve online safety. Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation started our app security project this year in response to what we see as a neglected part of the ongoing discussion around tech policy. While there's been plenty of talk about competition, interoperability, tinkering in these areas with policy creates necessary cybersecurity trade offs that we believe are largely being ignored. Each passing day means that more and more people and more parts of their lives are moving online, meaning that each passing day becomes the worst possible time to neglect cybersecurity. It may be hard to believe, but it was just last year that a cyber attack took down the Colonial Pipeline, sparking an energy crisis on the eastern seaboard. Earlier this year, a barrage of cyber attacks on Ukraine and Western Europe preceded Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Later in the year, as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's plane approached Taiwan, a barrage of cyber attacks similarly targeted Taiwanese websites. What this shows is that cyber attacks are thus becoming a more likely form of warfare in our modern times, even before the first shots are fired. So, cybersecurity, though, is not just a macro issue. As I said earlier, more and more parts of Americans' lives are moving online and onto our smart devices. So, when you leave your house, you usually these days leave with your phone, your wallet, your keys. But increasingly, those are all becoming integrated into your smart device. iPhones and Androids can already act as your wallet and keys, meaning that this is a device that needs to be as secure as possible and work 100% of the time. As we've seen with recent headlines about Chinese telecom and tech companies like Huawei and TikTok, access to personal devices is not just of interest to petty criminals, but indeed as much of a matter as national security as it is to personal security. So, with all of that said, to discuss the state of cybersecurity today and what policymakers are or perhaps aren't doing to protect Americans online, I'm pleased to be joined by some very distinguished guests. First, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Then we'll hear from remarks from our panelists, Shane Tews of the American Enterprise Institute and Brandon Pugh of R Street Institute. Then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. So with that, let me introduce General Keith Kellogg, who needs little introduction. He is a highly decorated, retired three-star Army general and has extensive experience in the military and international business. Most recently, he was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence. He also served as Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council. Kellogg has wide-ranging experience in Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa. With that, General Kellogg, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for inviting me today. And thanks to the Taxpayers Protection Alliance for hosting this event on cybersecurity. A little bit of background: I was probably a novice when it came to cyber and information technology until I became the Joint Chiefs of Staff J6, so the Director for Command and Control and Communications. And it was at that time I really got very, very interested in both in information technology and cyber warfare, because it was relatively new to the Defense Department and also to the public at large. You know, when you look at American infrastructure, be it the vital parts of it, be it banking or energy or the military, communications, it all comes down to cybersecurity and cyber activities. And we saw that, and Patrick mentioned that, what happened just a couple of years ago with the Colonial Pipeline. I live back here in Arlington, Virginia. And that was only a 6-day event when you had a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline and to shut it down. Yet back here in Arlington, Virginia, we saw gas lines form almost immediately. And people started to worry about were they going to be able to fill up their gas tank in their vehicles, or what they were going to have going forward. And it was a great concern. And that was just an isolated and very, very small event that really only lasted for 6 days. But if you get a massive attack on cyber on some of our key infrastructure, it could be devastating to the United States, especially if it came before some type of an attack. So when it looks at it, it comes down to a lot of ones and zeros when you talk about cyber and cyber warfare. One of the things we don't do well with cyber is I don't think we do well explaining it. It's Greek to a lot of people, and I noticed that not only when I was in the White House, but in the Pentagon as well. And when you tried to explain cyber activities, we always left it to the experts to explain. And generally, what the experts would do, they would drill down very hard, and you would look at those receiving the information, and the eyes would glaze over. You had to make it simple, very, very simple, for people to understand what cyber was all about, what cyber warfare was all about, what cyber protection was all about. And we didn't do a very good job of it. And that's why adversaries, I believe, have been able to capitalize on attacking a lot of our networks in the past as well as the future, both in the business world. And when I was in the business world, I worked for a corporation, and we would get an attack. And when I was first told this, I didn't believe it. We would get over 100,000 attacks in a day on our networks because they were trying to penetrate it. Then when I went back into government, I realized how well our adversaries were able to penetrate primarily the defense companies. When you look at a lot of the advances that our adversaries have made, and when I say adversaries, I'm talking primarily Russia and China. You look at a lot of the things they've developed, well, really, those are American products. They just modified them and morphed them into what they are today. And a lot of that is because they were able to penetrate not necessarily the government activities, meaning the Pentagon, but they were able to penetrate our defense contractors and lift from our defense contractors all the information. And that's because our defenses weren't good. And we have to understand that the Russians are going to do it, the Chinese are going to do it on a daily basis. And we haven't been able to protect our systems. So what do we need to do going forward? I think one, we have to first explain it to everybody, the importance of it. And sometimes we have to explain it time and time again. Example, when I went into the White House, we had our first meetings. And in our first meetings, we had cell phones going off. And we finally said, wait a second, you brought your personal cell phones into a meeting. And they said, oh, yeah. Well, they weren't concerned about it. Well, the cell phone's a transmission device. And we had pretty sensitive discussions. So we put lock boxes outside. And we still failed to have people not bring their cell phones into the very secure rooms. So the only place we were able to really have secure discussions was in the Situation Room, where we ensured through an ability to do so that people didn't bring their cell phones in because we could track if you had your cell phone with you. That's what I'm talking about when we have to have people understand the importance of cybersecurity and what cyber is all about and cyber defense is all about. We have to go out to our people in government. We have to talk to our legislative teams, and we have to say, look, we shouldn't have any more tech transfers from the United States of America. We used to be the leading producer of technology. It would always come to the United States. Now we're finding that most of it's foreign. And we have to be concerned about transfer of technology, or technical technology, to foreign adversaries. And I keep using the word adversaries because they are the Chinese and both the Russians. And we have to look at how they are able to mine our information and use our information. So we need to go to Congress. We need to say, okay, no more technology transfers from our technology base. And we need to bring that back to the United States and the shores back here and put barriers up. And yeah, I do say barriers to ensure that we protect our own industries and protect the growth of technology. When you look at 6G, we had to look for foreign, for be Nokia, we had to look for other foreign sources to actually develop good 6G technology. That should have never been done. We should have been able to do that in the United States of America. And the last thing I would say, we have to make sure that we increase our cyber defense, and whatever it takes to do so. And that is primarily explaining what cyber defense means to the general public and also to our legislative members, but also to people inside government. We sometimes rely on the National Security Agency to conduct cyber activities and to protect us, but that's not enough. We need to do it within our own industry, within our vital infrastructure, because that is probably primarily in the public domain. We need to make sure they understand how to do it and what it means to do it. So that's an education process. And people need to get educated. not in real technical terms, but they have to be explain how it's important to them, and then you continually hammer to make sure they finally understand and get it. And then the last thing is the role of space. Space technology is growing, and we have the Space Force. The Trump administration created the Space Force, and we learned one of the things that's most important about space is what we can do in the cyber domain. And when you look at the foreign adversaries that are out there, you look at primarily China, who has competed with us well. I tell everybody when you look at China about space, name the only country that's landed on the dark side of the moon. We don't know what they're doing. It's China. So there's always a competition in space, and that is the new domain we have to be aware of. So I'd ask everybody today to think about cyber. Think about how you can make it easy to understand. Think about cyber defense, how you ensure cyber defense is transmitted to our public officials, but also to the private partnership that we have out there, because the vast majority of infrastructure is actually in private hands, and how we make sure it's important to them. How we tell the people like Colonial Pipeline the importance of protecting your networks and how to do it as well. So, Patrick, I thank you for having this today. It should be a very good discussion, and I thank all the panelists as well. So, again, thanks for having me, and good luck to everybody in this important issue.
All right. Thank you very much, General Kellogg. And time permitting, if you'd like to join us for Q&A afterwards, feel free. But obviously, we understand that you have a very busy schedule. So next, I will hand it over to Shane Tews. Shane Tews is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works primarily on cybersecurity, technology and innovation policy, and internet governance issues. She's also president of Logan Circle Strategies, where she focuses on information and communication technology and cybersecurity policy issues, including privacy, data protection, 5G, next generation networking, the Internet of Things, internet governance, and digital economic policy. She's currently vice chair of the board of directors of the Internet Education Foundation, which governs outside work for the Congressional Internet Caucus and the State of the Net conferences. The chair of the Internet Society of the DC chapter, on the board of Seed AI, and the chairman of the board of directors of Tech Freedom. She's also chair of the Dynamic Coalition on Internet of Things for the International Internet Governance Forum. She has previously served as co-chair of the Internet Governance Forum USA and on the boards of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Information Technology Industry Council, and the Global Women's Innovation Network. Previously, Ms. Tews managed internet security and digital commerce issues as Vice President of Global Policy for VeriSign Incorporated. She began her career in the George H.W. Bush White House as Deputy Associate Director in the Office of Cabinet Affairs, later moved to Capitol Hill as Legislative Director for a member of Congress. Shane also hosts a podcast, Explain to Shane, on the AEI podcast channel. So Shane, with that, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you to the App Security Project for having this great dialogue at the very end of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. When we first started talking about this early on, when DHS was just being created, it was just challenging because most people were still sitting at their desks with their web browser as their only way that they were managing information, and trying to get them to understand that they needed to have a play in that security was always tough because most of them were on enterprise systems, and they felt like it was the goal and of whoever it was that handed them the device. And then more and more of us brought devices into our homes, not only personal laptops, but the ever-present mobile device. And it has now become the weak link in the cybersecurity chain of keeping our network secure. I like that General Keller reminded us that it's a transmission device and it works both ways. So sometimes you just don't know what that phone's up to. And that's why it's important that we really think about the construct of the phone, the hardware, the software, the ability of the user to be able to use it freely, but also not have to be concerned about certain things like security. Security is tough. Security was tough when you were just doing it on your personal device, when it was your computer, and that's sort of what we see some legislation wanting us to go back to, is say, hey, we're not gonna show up with security in as part of the design. We're gonna let you choose. Well, most people choose nothing. I mean, it's just part of the people, they always avoid friction when possible, especially with technology. So the idea of taking away what we've already put in place, and several major companies have really thought a lot about this, is definitely a huge challenge to the cybersecurity problems that we have today. I looked up a couple of reports knowing we were going to do this today. And in 2020, there was analysis that over 2.6 billion emails, 49 billion URLs, 1.9 billion mobile messages showed that criminals exploited the human error and compromise of devices, which means that they look for the easy way in. And this is true of real, analog crime, real crime, as it is in digital crime, is they like to find a way to get into your device, and that most likely is going to be by downloading a fake app. And then they are going to either monitor your information flow and find a pattern of behavior, and then potentially use you as the user as the exploit. And this may include, going into some of your bank accounts. There's a lot of bad things that can happen. They also can use you just as a mule onto another system by getting onto your network. So there's a lot we need to protect ourselves from, and that is currently in place, and we should want to keep that in place. So those are my kind of key moments to open up this conversation.
All right. Thank you very much, Shane. Really appreciate that. Next, I want to turn it over to Brandon Pugh. Brandon Pugh is a resident senior fellow and policy counsel at the R Street Institute's Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats team. Outside of R Street, he serves as an international law officer in the U.S. Army Reserve and on several boards, including a governor's advisory council. Prior to R Street, Brandon was legislative counsel for the New Jersey General Assembly Minority Office, where he handled nearly all legislation on cybersecurity, emerging technology, and privacy. He also served as a fellow with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the managing editor of the Journal of Law and Cyber Warfare, president/CEO of a Homeland Security advisory company, and an elected and appointed official at the local, county, and state level. This includes service as a vice president of a quasi-governmental entity representing New Jersey's nearly 600 school boards. Brandon has presented and been published dozens of times, including during congressional staff trainings on cybersecurity, authoring a report on national preparedness training, preparing cybersecurity guidance sent to thousands of public schools, and leading events with senior military intelligence and intelligence community officials. He has been awarded multiple times for his work by members of Congress and a governor of New Jersey, among others. He received his JD from Rutgers Law as a master community practitioner and as a certified information privacy professional. So with that, hand it over to Brandon.
Well, Patrick, thanks for having me. The introduction was way too kind, but first and foremost, I appreciate the Taxpayer Protection Alliance (TPA) and the App Security Project for hosting this, especially for your leadership in this, Patrick, as well as David's and the rest of your team. I enjoyed hearing from Shane and General Kellogg. That's the good and bad thing about going last is they've shared so many good things that I really don't have a lot to say. But in sincerity, I do. Once you give an attorney an opportunity to speak, they're always going to say something. But first off, happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I've been frequently asked, is there a benefit to this month? Does actually any benefit result? And I think there is a benefit. It spurs conversations like these. It raises awareness at the individual level. And as General Kellogg rightfully pointed out, cyber threats continue to be a concern. They continue to increase, and the threat is not going away. And I appreciate your point earlier, Patrick, was this isn't just a macro level issue. Yes, we've seen the concerns come from Ukraine and potentially how they could continue in the future. But this directly impacts consumers and individuals on a daily basis. So this is really just key for the federal government to continue to act. And this isn't just something that the administration needs to do, not something Congress needs to do alone. But there's a role for industry and states. But specifically when it comes to Congress, we have limited time left in this Congress, and even in a new one, there's so many priorities that there is a trade-off. In my opinion, when we act on legislation, we need to be acting on those pieces that maximize security and privacy. And if it's a piece of legislation that doesn't directly connect to security, at least we should be thinking through it to see if there is some sort of nexus. So I just want to highlight two areas, and we can circle back them in questions. It's just my concerns with current legislation that unfortunately negatively impacts security and privacy, even if that wasn't the intended goal. And then second is just the myriad of alternatives that we should be acting on, in DC. I hate to single it out because it's gotten a lot of negative attention, but I just want to flag antitrust legislation, in particular, the American Innovation Choice Online Act. I don't want to comment on antitrust policy overall. I'm not an expert on that, but what I can say is I am concerned about the cybersecurity, privacy, and national security implications of that legislation. I know the sponsors have done a lot of work to try to address those concerns, but in my opinion, they are still here. And we can go into them later, but I am concerned because, privacy and security is mentioned. Some of the text specifically flags that. For instance, there's an affirmative defense, there's an exception, but it's still inadequate. And I am afraid of what could result for consumer privacy and just national security overall, not to mention the impact it can have on our companies when it comes to competition, considering adversaries like General Kellogg mentioned, Russia and China aren't going to be impacted by this legislation. So that's a broad overview. I'd love to go into some of the specifics later, but then what can we do? I know we have, 2 months left in this Congress. There are some great bills out there that I think we should be prioritizing. First, my particular passion is acting on data security and data privacy legislation. We don't have a comprehensive federal bill in this country, and that negatively impacts consumers, industry, and security. We have an opportunity to move forward with the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, or ADPPA, or ADPA, however you want to refer to it today. That bill has come a long way with bipartisan, bicameral support. Matter of fact, we saw it pass out of committee with a 53-2 vote. And there are security provisions in that bill, some that would enhance our current posture and better protect consumers. So that's one. The second one is, it goes without saying, we have a cybersecurity talent shortage right now. Matter of fact, there's over 700,000 cyber jobs open in the U.S. And that directly impacts national security if we can't fill them. There is an effort underway by the Cybersecurity Clinics Grant Program Act. And essentially, this would create a grant program to fund clinics at community colleges and minority-serving institutions. And that would not only provide education to the students, but also go a long way to helping state and local governments, civil society organizations, and small businesses. And there's so many other things we should be doing and can be doing that positively improve privacy and security. And I think those should be the priorities.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. So we're going to get to some Q&A now, and I believe there's a feature that if the audience has questions that you can submit them, and we'll screen them, and hopefully you can get some questions into our panelists. Something that the general said in his opening remarks that I'd love to get both your takes, Shane and Brandon, on is that we don't do well at explaining cybersecurity. How would you each explain or hit home or hammer home, the importance of cybersecurity to the average person that's, got a lot of other things to worry about these days, particularly how they're putting food on the table and affording gas in their car? How do you hammer home the point that cybersecurity is something that they should care about on a personal level and at a policy level? I'll start with Shane.
I think, yeah. So first of all, it's not problematic. It's not only for citizens. It's really problematic that our lawmakers have a gap in understanding this tech, and they're yet still wanting to put legislation forward that could possibly damage the operating system. So I always say, this thing is with me all the time. I mean, I check this as many times as you check your house keys when you walk out. It has so much information that flows over it that I depend on. That the idea of my phone going down is like my day would be ruined, if not my week. So the idea that how do we keep people feeling informed about this and not feel that there's a risk factor is ensuring at the very beginning of the process there is a filter and somebody who's looking out for those bad guys. Attackers know if they can get a fake app installed on your mobile device, they can manipulate and get into the intentions of what you may or may not want to do. Sometimes they can completely control the phone. So explaining to them that this is the equivalent of leaving their front door open and doing nothing to protect their house and their valuables inside their house is the most fundamental way, I would say, that I would explain cybersecurity, because when you get into the network operations, there's a lot to say about it, but it's very complicated. And so the key thing is just reminding them that this is their digital home these days, and you want to keep it secured and under lock and key.
So Brandon, I'll turn it over to you. Same question. How do we get people to understand the importance of cybersecurity? How do we do a better job of explaining it to address the general's point?
Yeah, I have two answers, and it depends on who you're talking to. If you're speaking consumers and individuals need to realize this isn't some macro level issue that only happens in a war zone, or threats from Russia to the US or China to the US. Do those exist and are those reality? Yes. But this is something that can happen to individuals on a daily basis. We don't know, even when it comes to privacy, we don't know who our information is shared with. We don't know if it's going to China and being exploited there. So I think just driving it home that as a consumer, you need to take steps and just be aware of the threat. And then when it comes to elected officials, like Shane said, there is an education point of view there. I think a lot of times those in DC, giving them the benefit of the doubt, are acting on a piece of legislation that they think will improve things. But the concern is if they have unintended consequences when it comes to privacy and security, that can have ramifications for years. And if it harms national security, some of those, unfortunately, may be irreversible. And changing legislation in DC doesn't happen overnight. Yes, can that happen? Of course. But we need to be very careful before legislation is acted on, making sure it does actually enhance security and privacy.
Something else that the general talked about, the importance of preventing further tech transfers to hostile foreign nation states. Um, do we see any risks with some of the current legislation that's being proposed in terms of interoperability and competition, in terms of creating that kind of tech and data transfer that could be potentially exploited, not just by potential competitors, but by potential hostile nation states?
Yeah, opening up your operating system for interoperability is what a lot of legislation is calling for, even over in the EU, is always tricky and slightly terrifying. There are certain elements of open architecture that make sense, but that's much more in a sandbox engineering element where they're saying, let's see what we can make work. How do we make sure that things move smoothly along in the process, and the operating system is designed to be resilient around that. It's not designed to have somebody come in and figure out how to, like, just kind of bullet get themselves into all, into your other applications, which is part of the challenge. Is you don't want somebody to be able to get onto your device and then be able to actually get in and through to other information that's on the device through other applications. So the interoperability challenge, I think, really needs to be looked at from a serious security metric before we think it's an economic metric of just making sure that there's a balance of power between little guys being able to get onto the same type of platform operations that big guys do. There's value to certain interoperabilities, and the companies understand that, and that's why things like message services, some of them interoperate, some of them are siloed, and people use them for their siloed reasons, like Signal and WhatsApp doesn't move across to others. That's something you choose as a consumer, but we shouldn't be mandating that all these things need to be able to interop with each other, because what it does is that lowers the standard of security on all the applications, which is not going the right direction.
Yeah, and Shane, great point. There's two areas of concern. Well, we're like four in that one piece of legislation I mentioned earlier pertaining to antitrust. And two of my largest ones are around data access and interoperability. Because, if you don't comply with that and you're a company, you have kind of two choices. Either you don't comply and you set yourself up for legal challenges, and you're put on the defensive because it's only an affirmative defense, or you do comply and now you risk jeopardizing your customers' data privacy and their security. So neither one's a good outcome. It's easy to say, like, we want to share data and allow others on the platform because that's going to help innovation. It's going to help these small companies succeed and have a chance. Like, putting aside the policy merit to that, but we don't know who these third parties are. Is it a third party from China that's not been properly vetted, that has a more sinister motive rather than just competing? We don't know, and that's a very open question. That's a concern.
So, are there tools right now on Americans' devices that they can use to help improve their own cybersecurity, whether it is, in regards to, preventing data transfers to China or Russia or something like that, or just protecting themselves in their day-to-day interactions from petty criminals? What are some of the features that Americans have on their phones right now, and even on their laptops or other devices, that they can use to kind of shore up their own defenses? I'll ask you first, Brandon.
Yeah, so I would say more specific answer for consumers than a broader answer on what we should do. For consumers, I think that is the benefit of downloading apps from an app store. Is it always going to be foolproof? No, but at least there is some level of certainty that there's been a vetting, there's been some sort of security provisions. And I think that is, for a lay consumer, that's something you do have that degree of certainty. And I think that is a benefit. And second, it just goes back to the basics of cybersecurity. You're never going to be able to successfully always thwart a bad actor, especially if they're targeting you. But there are things you can take on a daily basis to make yourself, better off. And that just goes, it's simple as things as like your privacy settings, who you're allowing your data to be shared with. But then on a broader level, I mentioned needing data privacy and data security legislation. That current legislation would at least tell a consumer when their information is being shared with their adversaries. So if your data is going to China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, you would at least know that proactively. Whereas currently, you don't have that level of knowledge. So as an American, your data could be sold to a Chinese company or perhaps even funneling to the Chinese government, all without your knowledge.
So Shane, Brandon said, first point was downloading through vetted app stores. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful for a consumer to just know that they don't have to make that initial decision of how secure is the item that they're looking at, and the App Store has a human element that some of the other stores don't. That make sure that the things that perhaps can cause harm are at least reviewed. And if the decision is that they're actually that's it's okay, they're there, whatever they stated the app was for is going to be okay, they can move it forward. Because the one thing that mobile malware it relies on tricking the users, so you need to make sure up front that they if they're buying a gaming app, which is where a lot of it actually kind of starts. Is I name one comes to mind, but it's like they'll come online, and then you start attaching. People want to then work gaming apps specifically. They want to play games with you, and you need to make sure that along the way there's some entity in that device that is vetting the crossover on the networks of who's accessing your information. Not that you're saying, hey, I just want to go play a game with this person. Once I've agreed and given a permissive yes to that they can then roam around on whatever device that I'm using. And the App Store is the first line of defense on that. It isn't perfect, but it is by far much better than nothing. And if you prefer nothing, there are opportunities to buy things where you can, put on whatever device you wish and then just kind of live with the consequences. So I think the App Store is something that we should be very thankful for, as consumers is there and available for us. And if it's something that you don't choose to want to use, you have other options.
Yeah, and
So
just a quick follow-up, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Patrick. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I just wanted to agree with Shane, because there are other options. So that's a phenomenal point. Another benefit to the App Store is just in terms of pushing out updates. I have to admit, there's a million things going on in my life. The last thing I'm going to do is go and search and see if my app has been updated recently. So having them push to me, I actually appreciate, because if there's security or privacy enhancements, I'm happy if they're done automatically. And secondly, we even myself, if I was vetting an app, I would have certain things I'd look for in that app to see if it was secure and actually doing what it was intended to do. But the vast majority of Americans are not going to go through the app word for word, analyze it, and then take the next step. Should I download it and use it? So we could have a malicious app out there that a lot of Americans are downloading when it looks seemingly secure. So that's a concern.
Well, when talk about it, I say it's more an enterprise but it also goes to consumers. We used to say the most dangerous part in the network was the 6 feet or 6, whatever, in between the user and the keyboard. And now we have, we've taken that and we've put it into everybody's hands, and we have billions of devices. And this is, it's the human decision on what to do with something. It's like a lot of things in life where you put the surrounding parameters to how I want to secure myself, and then I move forward in that, deciding different things. And the apps are doing that for you by being vetted, because that's part of the challenge. Is it's the user who is causing the problem at the end of the day. And so when we think about things like legislation or regulation, we have to remember that we have to be thinking as part of this on how these devices are used, and go back to General Kelly's concern about just having people having phones in White House meetings. They are a transmission device. So we need to make sure that the levers of control, and most of these apps give you a lever of security. You can decide what level you want to go on that. There's parental controls that are all on these apps that allow you to decide how much measured you want to be on information flow, depending on if the device is being used by a kid. So those are also things, as well as cybersecurity, is we just need to think about how the user is using the device and how we can simplify making decisions for them, so it's not a complicated endeavor to keep secure.
So we've got a couple questions that have come in from the audience. I've got a first one for you. We've kind of talked about this already a little bit, but I think they've got a great point at the end of their question that I would love to hear you both address. So what steps do consumers need to take to secure their mobile devices? Both speakers have mentioned consumers need to actively secure their devices, but what does that mean? I think we've talked about making sure that you're downloading stuff from a vetted source like an app store. But if you can elaborate on that point of how consumers can protect their devices. But their final question was, is it not clicking accepting all cookies, or is it something more than that? So I'd love to hear. I thought that was an interesting point there at the end. So I would love to hear some more maybe expanded thoughts on how consumers can protect themselves, not just on their devices, but online broadly.
So I'm
Shane,
a huge fan of the work that Apple did on when they allowed you to know when your device, when certain things are being used by, like, the voice and GPS. You can tell by there's a the light on the top of your phone. And there are days where I'm like, which app is still up going? Because when you get in an Uber, you get in a Lyft, it's going because it's using your GPS, and the phone's notifying that by keeping something that's it's giving me an understanding of that on the top of my phone, which I appreciate. And then when you stop using the app and it's still there, that's just not a good sign. So part of it is an awareness of how the devices work, choosing wisely when you're choosing apps. If there's apps that you've downloaded that you're not using anymore, delete them. I mean, if you have a lot of them are happy for you to just stop using them, and they'll keep the information flow going, and they're selling the data that is going off your phone, even if it's not specifically on that app. So be conscientious of what you download, how it's being used, and if you've kind of abandoned the app, just go ahead and delete at that point. It's also true of just data in general. I know that Brandon was talking about privacy, and I'm a big proponent of a federal privacy law, because I feel we've just gotten to that point where it's just gotten too confusing to have all these different communities trying to decide how they want your data to be used. It's also hard to explain to the marketing element that they don't need years and years of data for what they're trying to do. If they're trying to sell something, they probably only need the last couple months or 6 months of a user's data. And so this whole idea of data hoarding by all these companies, they need to start streamlining that just to keep users from having all this information flow going off their phone. And then on the marketing side, they just have this data bloat that goes on, and that is ripe for criminals. Criminals love that. Just giving them this huge area where they can go in and find information, and and find a way to perpetrate most likely one of your bank accounts or financial accounts, or perhaps in the case of children, since they all have a social security number, they do what they call synthesized identities. And you don't know until your kid's going to college that somewhere along the way someone collected enough information about the child to create an adult profile, and they have a mortgage that they've probably never paid down, and now you have problems getting a student loan. So this doesn't have as much to do with the actual app as the process that we go through in today's society about how information flow is used. And the device is just the starting point. And so we need thinking about the security of it from the entire supply chain of information flow.
Any thoughts,
Yeah,
Brandon?
I think a good practice is just reviewing your privacy settings as well. Like, what apps are you allowing to track your location? I know I proactively try to do that every week or two. And it's amazing, even if I download a new app, that it's routinely tracking me. Granted, it's to help make the app function, but there are certain apps that just don't need to be able to follow me around. I don't need them for location services. So I think that's even just a good step. I just want to call attention to an effort underway in DC. Some of the listeners may have seen this, but the White House convened an Internet of Things device label meeting last week. Essentially, the thought would be that if you buy an IoT device, like a smart camera or a smart TV, just to name a couple, it could have some sort of insignia on there saying the product's met a baseline standard. It's been nicknamed the Energy Star for cyber. So the thought would be is, if you're a consumer going to buy a camera, right now it's a Wild West. You don't know what security measures are implemented. You don't know where it's coming from. But at least if you saw like this QR code or this check mark or some sort of insignia, you would at least know that it's met some sort of baseline. I think if an initiative like that continued, I think that would be helpful. There's still a lot of logistics and specifics to work around, including consumer awareness. That's huge, because like, you can put that on a box or on a website, but if a consumer doesn't understand it, then the effort's kind of pointless. So that's going to be a challenge. And then secondly is around enforcement. But I think that has potential to help consumers in the future. And right now, that's something the National Security Council is pushing, but in conjunction with industry. Industry is weighing in heavily. So there's a lot to go with that process, but something to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, absolutely. So to their point about cookies, it's not necessarily that all cookies are bad. It's you have to just be cognizant of who you're actually allowing onto your device, whether that's your laptop or your smartphone. Would that be a good way to summarize it?
Yeah, we are still here in the U.S. If you say no, it's binary. It's either yes or no to cookies, and if you say no, most websites just don't let you on. They're just like, sorry. In Europe, who really started this whole cookie situation, which we emulated here in the United States for simplicity, basically, you can say no to certain parts of the cookie, and it'll still let you on the website, and you can still interoperate with that web portal. So they've proven it's there's an ability to do it. It's just a choice now of the company of, do they need to have all that data that the cookie used to provide, or are they willing to let you just take the few services that you want and then step on and step off their platform? So that's cookies have evolved, but not all websites have evolved with how cookies have moved forward.
Exactly.
I want to
and this, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, yeah, sure thing. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag here. So I wanted to get to some other questions from the audience, but I certainly wanted to hear your answer on whether or not folks should be saying yes to cookies or not.
Well, saying yes or no is a loaded question, but there is a purpose for cookies, but they can also have a bad outcome as well. And I think that really underscores the need for having a privacy law, a data security, data privacy law in the U.S., which we don't have. Like, a lot of that would help regulate what information is collected on a user visiting a website and how it's used, who it's shared with, how long it's retained for, how it's secured. Just so many questions that don't have answers now. Because right now in the US, for listeners not familiar, it's done on a state-by-state basis. Right now, we have 5 states that have a privacy law, but the vast majority don't. And we have 27 other states that this year alone have been trying to act on that. So it's really creating a patchwork, which isn't ideal, because it's a nightmare for industry to follow what law is applicable today in what state. And it's also bad for consumers because you don't have consistent rights, or more likely, you live in a state that doesn't have any data protection framework, so you have no rights. So I think that really just underscores the need for having action on privacy, to have answers to how cookies are used and have some guidance around that, and really just empower consumers.
So want to get to some other questions that we've gotten from the audience, and we've gotten 2 in that are fairly similar, but very pointed, I would say. Can you elaborate on how/why antitrust impacts national security? And the second question is, with proposed legislation like the Open App Markets Act, which is one of the antitrust bills, what is Congress's role in protecting cybersecurity? So those are sort of the same question, and I just want to kick it to you guys for the sort of the pointed answer there. Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, not to shamelessly promote my own work, but so my former director, Tatiana Bolton, and I did an analysis specifically, on the American Innovation Choice Online Act, but we really went provision by provision and flagged areas of concern, and there was multiple of them. We've touched on a few of them, but essentially, if you're not familiar with how this legislation works, and this is an overgeneralization, so if you're listening, don't critique me for overgeneralizing it. But essentially, it prevents a series of actions and makes them as unlawful conduct if a covered entity were to do them. And we've touched on a few of them. One of them is around data access mandates. So it limits the ability of a company to restrict their data. Another one is around interoperability. Another provision targets restricting uninstalling software applications or changing settings. Another one could impact content moderation. So I'd say those are 4 large ones. But here's the challenge, just to make a specific example. If you want to limit your data, that doesn't have an exception for cybersecurity. So you can imagine transferring data to a third party. It sounds like it could be helpful because it may be helping a new starting company, but you're kind of put on the defensive. If you see there's a cybersecurity or privacy concerns with sharing that data, you're relying on an affirmative defense now. So you go to court and have to claim that we did that action because we were trying to protect cybersecurity. So it's not ideal, because you want companies to proactively be taking steps that enhance security and privacy, not be concerned about being open to litigation and now having to demonstrate potentially years later about what they did and actually how it was beneficial to security. So kind of what we recommend is a few things: either just outright removing some of these provisions, or second, perhaps restructuring how the exceptions work around cyber and privacy, along with how the affirmative defenses work as well. So I'll let Shane go, but I'm happy to circle back and actually go into some of the provisions, if that's helpful.
So on the antitrust competition part, I think the biggest challenge I see is the ability to inhibit innovation. So much has happened in the technology space that we have all benefited from, and this is just like a hard hit the brakes on just very specific companies that these legislators seem to be upset with, but they're not upset about the same type of behavior if we look at it from an analog perspective. So I mean, very specific. It's like, if you're mad at Amazon for being efficient on the way that they're getting things to your door very quickly and having what you have in stock, you should be just as angry if somebody else is doing it, like Target or Costco. But these guys aren't in the space. They're just saying it's only if it's a digital medium of a particular company of a particular size. So it's highly targeted, and it's American companies, and these are American legislators doing it. It's so frustrating when you see that. We know why Europe's doing it. Europe's doing it because they're trying to figure out if there's in any way they can catch up. And so far, they haven't really found a way to do that. We shouldn't have American legislators deciding to, once you do these precautionary principles and proactive, you can't merge, you have these, caps on what you can acquire, because the way technology continues to innovate means it grows, and it grows sometimes past its original intent into something else. And that usually takes a merger or an acquisition of certain parts. Very old school, example is Microsoft and spell check. Spell check was not created by Microsoft; it was purchased, and that was a great addition. I use it all the time. So it's one of those things where they want to improve something. A lot of the developers are looking for that niche element where they can go in and improve on someone's product, and they want to be eventually part of a bigger team, or they want to do that, sell it off, and go back to their innovating initial source. So the idea of targeting these specific companies, using a market cap as a way to decide, to delineate that they're in trouble and the other ones aren't, for very similar activities, I find that all very troubling operations from our legislators. I would really like them to be thinking about security more, and not how to mess with an economy that the digital economy is working. So let's give it incentive to keep working.
All right. Some great answers. So we're running up against time here, and I just want to make sure that I give you both the opportunity to offer some closing thoughts on Cybersecurity Awareness Month in general, and where you think potentially Congress and other policymakers are acting in a good way, a proactive way, and where they may be falling short. So why don't we start with you, Brandon?
Yeah, so I just take it back to Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I've seen a lot of good things emerged this month alone, in terms of the local government conversations that have resulted, campaigns that target consumers to make them more aware. So I've seen a lot of positive things come out of it. But I think there's a lot of room for Congress to continue to act. Obviously, the elections, seemingly a few days away now. And then we have the lame duck period. So I'm hopeful that Congress in that period will continue to act on pieces of legislation that enhance security and privacy, not those that potentially, whether intended or not, do the exact opposite. And I don't want to seem like I'm critical of certain members, because I'm sure they're well-intended in their efforts. I just get scared when there could be just cyber and privacy implications that could emerge, the kind of like I flagged earlier. So while I mentioned just two in particular around the Cyber Clinics Grant Program Act and data security, data privacy law, I think those should be the main efforts during the lame duck period. There's just so many other areas that could emerge. I mean, we've had fantastic efforts like the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. A lot of their recommendations were implemented. I think that should just be the start. Our cybersecurity threats are only increasing, only continuing to get worse. So this can't be seen as a one-time effort to enhance security and privacy. We need to continue to act in efforts to enhance those areas. But then at the same time, as other pieces of legislation come up, we need to be critical in terms of how they may impact national security and cybersecurity. It's really just, in benefit to the entire country.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Shane, final thoughts from you.
So, Brandon, I think you bring up a really good part that we haven't talked about, which is local governments and the importance of them being plugged into, DHS has some wonderful digital resource programs that they can, utilize to make sure that they are not the weak point, especially for nation state actors. I think about what Baltimore went through, a couple of years ago, where they got a ransomware attack, and it took them a really long time to get that untangled and decide if they were going to pay them or what they're going to do. We didn't talk about the importance of, knowing what to do. Sorry, police sirens, with ransomware attacks, and the on the civilian side. It's a very challenging time to know when should you communicate with the government, what do you need to do? And one of the great things that has happened as DHS has matured is they're much better about having a way to filter in information so people see if there's a similarity in the attacks. Is this becoming a nationwide situation where they're doing this to the same type of industry partners but around other parts of the United States? And there are sometimes these really small elements, like they go after small grocery stores or dry cleaners. They just lock up their systems. They know it's easy money. These people, they expect they've gone to an entire digitized system, and if they can lock up their system for 2 days or over a weekend, they'll lose thousands of dollars. So they'll pay $600-700, which doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about the federal government, but when you're talking about a local store, they don't know what to do, and so they end up paying this ransomware. And so the idea of having the local entities really think about this, tell people. The DC government had no problem telling us that it was best when during the nice weather we shouldn't run because things are bad right now in DC. They actually put something out that said that, but they haven't gone out of their way to say, we how to keep your the small businesses safe. And you're seeing more and more resources in that area. And I think the local government and the state chief information officers need to be thinking about the data they have on us as we pay our taxes. We put information into their systems to make sure that's secure. So as a citizen, I know that my governments, the multiple governments that I'm dealing with, are doing things to make sure that my information and my data is secure. That's another really important part of cybersecurity.
All right. Thank you both so much. We're running up against time here, so I just want to close off the panel here and thank our audience for joining us, and also thank our panelists for joining us, certainly General Kellogg for his insights, Tews with the American Enterprise Institute, and Brandon Pugh with R Street Institute. Thank you both so much for joining us for this discussion on cybersecurity awareness and Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I'm Patrick Hedger with the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation, again, with our App Security Project. You can find out more about what we're doing and everything that our panelists had to say by going to appsecurityproject.org. Follow us on Twitter, and continue to engage with us. And as we continue to educate both policymakers and taxpayers alike about the importance of cybersecurity and the different features that their devices have to protect them from nefarious state and petty criminal actors in cyberspace. So with that, I wish everybody a happy and safe Halloween, and thank you for joining us for this event during Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And please stay tuned as we have more information coming out related to cybersecurity from the App Security Project. So once again, appsecurityproject.org, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick.